Okay, Dr. Duchamp here again to discuss the second half of Plato's Republic, in which Thrasymachus enters the conversation. So, there's a couple of things I want to mention in preparation. Number one, we want to notice, and I may have said this in the last lecture, that Socrates kind of changes the subject. I thought we were talking about, money with Cephalus and justice with regard to sort of human law. Socrates, though, notices that things which might be required by law, for instance, to return something that you promised to, aren't moral. It wouldn't be right to return the weapon to the insane person or the murderous person. So he seems to expand the discussion of justice to a discussion of what we might just call righteousness or moral correctness in general. And the Greek word dikosune, which means justice, does capture both. So throughout Greek philosophy, you see the term justice being used specifically to refer to law, human law, or more broadly to refer to moral rightness in general. Okay, so we're talking about moral rightness. Let's remember that. Number two, who is Thrasymachus? Thrasymachus is a sophist. That's S-O-P-H-I-S-T. So the term philosophy, the love of wisdom, Sophia means wisdom. The term sophist is used in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way because the sophists were rhetoricians. That is, they were men who were very good at speaking and persuading others, but they weren't necessarily interested in the truth. I hate to make this comparison, but sort of how we might think of lawyers, that lawyers are very good at arguing for whichever side they're supposed to be on. They're not necessarily interested in who actually did it or what the real facts of the case are. Rather, how can they manipulate things such that their side wins. And the sophists were relativists, meaning that they did not really think there was any truth to be discovered that was absolutely true, for every person, at every time, and in every place. Those sorts of truths didn't exist, according to the sophists, and so there wasn't any point in seeking for them. Instead, you should just learn how to persuade and how to gain power, if that's what you want. Now, let's remember that the Athenians are Democrats, right? Not capital D Democrats, but lowercase d Democrats. They're actually some of the first in the world to try rule by the people. Demos means people. And so all of these young aristocratic men, of course only landowning males, were actually voting, about 15% of the Athenian population. So all of these young aristocratic males were hanging around in the marketplace trying to learn how to be persuasive so that they could be powerful in politics, so that they could perhaps become a demagogue. And the sophists were making a good living teaching the art of persuasion, which is called rhetoric. Now, this is a very highly respected art in Greek society. Of course, we will sometimes use the word rhetoric, in a kind of denigrating way. But to the Greeks, rhetoric was a very serious art, and I think in our own case it really is too. For instance, the way we talk about our politicians, we do pay a lot of attention to how persuasive they are and what good speakers they are and what sorts of arguments they give. Socrates and the sophists were at odds with one another because Socrates did think that there was absolute truth, and he didn't really know what it was, but he thought it was out there, and he had faith that it was out there, and he wanted to find it. So the sophists didn't like him. Thrasymachus is a great example here. He comes swooping in violently into the conversation. He's angry. One of the reasons he's angry at Socrates is because he knows that Socrates is faking. And this is true. Socrates uses a kind of irony in which he pretends that he doesn't know the answer. Now, I don't mean to say Socrates doesn't really know the answer. It's true. He doesn't think he fully grasps certain concepts. But in conversation, it's often the case that Socrates knows full well that he disagrees with what the person is saying, or he understands what they're saying, but they're wrong. Instead of coming right out and saying that, though, he will feign ignorance. He'll say things like, "Could you please explain this to me? I can't understand it." And it's pretty funny in some of the dialogues, but it's clearly somewhat deceptive. Thrasymachus hates this. He says, why don't you just come out and say what you think and stop beating around the bush? But of course we know that this is part of the Socratic method. The Socratic method is Socrates' style of arguing in which he wants the interlocutor, that is the person he's talking to discover for themselves whatever the conclusion is, even if the conclusion is just that their own Okay, slight technical difficulty there. My batteries died, but I'm back a few hours later to finish the lecture. I believe I was saying that Socrates, I was talking about the Socratic method, and Socrates calls himself a midwife. So if you know anything about midwives, they're not like doctors. They don't refer to themselves as the deliverer of the baby. They say that the mother is the one who delivered it, and as a midwife, you're simply helping the mother to go through a natural process. And similarly, Socrates wants the people who he is talking to realize whatever their conclusion is for themselves. They have to realize through their own intellectual experience that their idea of something was mistaken, that they were being narrow-minded, whatever the case may be. So he's a midwife in that sense. He's kind of guiding them. So he uses that somewhat deceptive technique in order to get people to, sort of follow him down a certain path such that they can understand it for themselves. And I think you all have probably experienced this, where if someone just tells you something directly, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. But if then you undergo the experience, somehow you grasp it in a different way, in a more real way. And I think that's what Socrates is going for. Thrasymachus just hates this. he's as you see from the text, he calls Socrates a sniveling, idiot, and so forth. Okay, so the tension between the two is palpable, and this is a tension between Socrates and the sophists in general. Socrates is executed at the end of his life in 399 BC, and in his defense that he gives, it's called the Apology, but we're using the term apology here to mean defense, not that he's saying he's sorry, because he wasn't sorry. He's defending himself, and he says, one of the major points he wants to make is that they're getting him mixed up with the sophists. And he says the sophists and I are two totally different groups of people. We have different values. Okay, so what does Thrasymachus say about justice? Well, he's tired of, Socrates sort of defending the traditional view that justice has something to do with what's morally right in some deeper, true way. And he says, rather, come on, let's be realistic. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that we're all patting ourselves on the back for being good law-abiding citizens, but what are these laws? They're just whatever is beneficial to whoever is in charge, to the government, right? To whoever has the power. And so what are we really doing except serving those other people? Are we really doing what's right, or are we just doing what's convenient for whoever has the power over us? Furthermore, Thrasymachus is convinced that if I was the one in power, I would impose whatever rules benefited myself. And that in fact none of us obey either the human laws or even just your basic moral or social rules because we want to or because we see something intrinsically valuable about it. Rather, we obey the rules because we don't want to, or we are just, so to speak, because we don't want to suffer injustice. We don't want to be the ones who are on the receiving end of some bad action. But in fact, if we were the ones in power, we would be happy to be abusive to others. So he defines justice as the advantage of the stronger. Now, really, in this section of Book 1, Thrasymachus is using the word justice in two different ways. Sometimes he's using it in his way to mean whatever rules the stronger imposes on everybody else. And he says, good for them. Bully for you if you've got the power and charm and wit to pull the wool over everybody else's eyes. he's not going to blame you for that. He's going to praise you for that. He's going to say you really have skill, that you can do that, and you've got all the power. So he uses justice to refer to the ruler, the advantage of the ruler. Then on the other hand, sometimes when he talks about justice, he's referring to sort of Socrates' idea of justice, the sort of traditional do what's right kind of idea of justice. And he's saying there's something really false about that second view. I'm not doing what's right. I'm doing what serves whoever is in power. Okay, so he gives a couple of examples to try and prove that justice is, or injustice is always more beneficial than justice. So I would do injustice if I could, because it's always more beneficial to me. The reason I don't do it is because I'm not smart enough to pull it off. I'm going to get caught, or I'm not going to be able to do it on a large enough scale for it to be of great advantage to me. But if I could, I would. So he gives a couple of examples, 3 examples. Doing injustice in a business deal, doing injustice with your taxes, paying your taxes, and doing injustice when it comes to going into politics. And in each of these cases he argues that the unjust man comes out better, if you remember from the text. So he says, if you make a contract with somebody and then you get right up to the end when everybody's fulfilled their parts and then you opt out and run off with the profits, you do better, right? And the honest guy who did his part and was going to keep the contract gets screwed. Too bad for him. With your taxes, the person who hides things on their taxes doesn't have to pay as much. Assuming you do it in a clever way, then good for you. And the person who's honest, what does he get out of it? He just ends up paying more. That's it. And putting more into the coffers of the rulers. And so there's no benefit to having been honest in that case. And finally, going into politics especially, the unjust man always comes out better because his friends are happy with him because he can do them favors. And of course he can get things for himself, bribes, for instance. The just man is hated. A really good example of this, actually, is the wonderful 1960s film, A Man for All Seasons, which is just the movie version of the play. It's about Thomas More, who was an advisor to King Henry VIII. And Thomas More was just a really honest guy. He was just a principled person who, he wouldn't approve of what King Henry VIII was doing, and he did, in fact, get killed. And there's this famous play, A Man for All Seasons, based on his life. And you see throughout the play and throughout the film that when he's a judge, everybody hates him because he won't take bribes. People that he could help hate him because he won't help them if he doesn't think they would really be good in the position. They ask for recommendations and he says, I don't think you'd be good in that position. I think you should be a teacher. Well, then they hate him. One of the guys that he refuses to give a recommendation to ends up being the guy that lies and gets him killed at the end of his life. And he won't sign the contract, agreeing to King Henry VIII being the head of the church. Because he just doesn't actually agree. He's being honest. His wife and children lose everything. They lose their friends. They lose their property. He's living in a tower, being fed breadcrumbs. And you think to yourself, what was the great gain here? And so Thrasymachus is making this kind of argument. He's saying, well, bully for you that you were honest, but all you did was serve the purposes of King Henry VIII. Now he's got you out of the way, he can go on. And so, what does it benefit anybody if you're just in politics? As a matter of fact, you can hardly get anything done if you're just in politics. If you actually try to be honest, people won't cooperate with you because you won't make deals with them. Your family will be annoyed because you're not getting them special favors, etc. So he argues that it's always more beneficial to be unjust. Now, let's notice here that both Socrates and Thrasymachus think that there has to be some inner motivation to do whatever it is that you're doing. I mean, in other words, you have to think that it's good or for your good or having to do with happiness in some way. it doesn't occur to them, and really it doesn't occur until much later in philosophy with a guy named Immanuel Kant, that you could just have to do something out of pure duty without any inner motivation. It just simply doesn't occur to the Greeks that could be possible. And in a way, there is something sort of inscrutable about Kant's idea. How can you talk about me doing something purely out of duty and not talk to me about what my motivations are? The Greeks are assuming, there's got to be some motivation here. So it's a compelling argument that Thrasymachus is making here. What's the motivation to be good? What is it? And we're going to see this at the very beginning of Book 2 with the great story, the Ring of Gyges story, that Glaucon tells, where he kind of sets up this problem. Why be good? Why? If you can get away with being bad. See, a lot of times we're good because we don't want to get caught being bad. But if I could get away with being bad, would there be any reason to be good? And it's a real challenge to Socrates' view. Okay, so how does Socrates respond? Well, he goes back to the same sort of argument that he's making in other areas as well. I call this the proper function argument. In the proper function argument, the idea is that the good for a thing is that it's operating according to its nature. So, for instance, my eyes have a proper function. They're supposed to see things, right? That's sort of what they're for. I mean, they may have some secondary purposes as well, but obviously the main purpose is to see. So if I'm blind, then my eyes are not functioning properly. Okay, he gives many examples in the first part of the book, which I think you'll remember. For instance, he talks about musicianship. And he says, well, a musician doesn't want to outdo other musicians. That's not the point. He wants to make great music, right? So he wants to cooperate with other musicians. The only person he's trying to outdo is the unmusical person. So if you find a musician who's trying to outdo other musicians, insofar as they're acting that way, they're not really being a musician. They're trying to be a rock star or something. I mean, in other words, it's really about their ego. It's not really about their musicianship. Similarly, if a doctor, say, we're going to prescribe prescription medicine for you that you don't need because he's getting a kickback from the prescription medicine company, from the pharmaceutical company, we would say, insofar as he's doing that, he's being a bad doctor. Why? Because being a doctor is supposed to be about making you healthy, not about making money. He's operating not as a doctor there, but as a wage earner, or like a profiteer. And so he's not being a good doctor. And why? That's because being a doctor has its proper function. So Socrates makes this exact same argument with regard to being a ruler. He says being a ruler has a proper function too. And he says it's really a sort of shepherd. The ruler is the shepherd of the community. And, he's supposed to care for the sheep, for the people. Well, this is a bad metaphor for Socrates to bring up. Thrasymachus jumps right on it. And he says, oh, yes, yes, yes. Rulers are just like shepherds. They fatten you up for the slaughter. Yeah, they're going to let you make money so they can tax you, right? Or they're going to let you be free up to a certain point. Just like the shepherd takes such good care of his sheep until he shears them and then slaughters them. So we're finally left with this issue, and here's two terms for you. Intrinsic and extrinsic good. Is justice or right action an intrinsic good? That is it something that we value for itself? Or on the other hand, is it something that we value just because it has good consequences? And if the good consequences were taken away, what do we think we would do? And of course we have many cases of this, right? People who have sacrificed their life for a good cause, and we have to ask ourselves whether that was a rational choice on their part. At the end of the dialogue, we see something sort of classic occur for a Socratic dialogue, which is that it ends in what I call aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A, aporia, which is a Greek term meaning a kind of non-conclusion. Socrates doesn't really know what justice is. He doesn't have a great definition for it, but we have narrowed it down. We know it's not what Kepler thought it was. We know it's not what Paul Marcus thought it was. And he's pretty sure it's not what Thrasymachus thinks it is either. He says, no, there's an inherent value to doing the right thing. There's a reason to do it that is part of its nature, or part of the nature of being human. It's not just about good consequences, because there are times when the consequences will not be good. There are those exceptional cases when the consequences or the external consequences will not be good. But there's something internal that still matters. And Socrates really does believe that the unjust person is a wretched person, and that the just person has a kind of inner peace. And the term that he sometimes uses is harmony, that there's a kind of inner harmony. And so Socrates is not coming exactly to a definition, but this is a big hint as to what Plato is going to tell us in the rest of the book. Justice is some sort of harmony. It's some sort of correct functioning of the human soul, with each part of the human person working together in the right way. And we do think of something as working well when it's functioning correctly. So it's good for me when I am functioning correctly, and doing the right thing is me functioning correctly. And so it has to be good. And he thinks that that inner harmony is going to lead to a kind of inner peace, perhaps even an inner peace that transcends terrible external circumstances. Socrates is a kind of idealist when it comes to this, because Plato thinks that the soul is, or the consciousness is really the human person. To a great extent, he's going to say that other people cannot harm me. External circumstances cannot harm me. It's really up to me. It's a matter of my approach, my conscious approach to life, that translates into something being considered harmful to me by me, right? And so if I'm the one who's really in control of my own consciousness, and that's my personhood, then I'm in control of whether I'm happy or not. External circumstances do not determine that. Now, that's highly idealistic. Aristotle is going to say, well, there are some external circumstances no one can overcome. But to a great extent, Aristotle, who will study after Plato, is going to agree with this. He's going to say, yeah, to a great extent, human beings ought to be really in control of their own happiness. And I believe Socrates thinks that we are, and that being just is the road to happiness. But we're going to take a kind of roundabout route to find out how.